In this episode, Constantinople, the last hope. Let's talk about the many events leading up to the Battle of Tours. Beginning in 633, the Muslim expansion shakes the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and ultimately Europe. In 717, there stood only one force stopping Islam from world domination and the unraveling of Western civilization. In this episode, we take a look at how the religion of peace shared its culture with the world on the edge of a bloody scimitar.
In the dark shadows and in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the Abracast, we are the brave and bold. When Muhammad died on June 8th, 632, he had no living male heir. There were four candidates to succeed him as leader of the Muslim community: Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. As things turned out, each served in turn as the successor to Muhammad. They are known as the rightly guided caliphs because they all had heard the revelation of the Prophet himself and had been guided by his example. Although Ali was the most closely related to the Prophet, it was Abu Bakr who was elected Muhammad's successor. By a mixture of force and diplomacy, he brought the tribes of Arabia, who had renounced their allegiance to the Muslims on the death of the Prophet, back to obedience, and sought a common enterprise to unite them following the Prophet's last wish. He sent them, under Meccan leaders, against the Byzantine and Persian empires. Abu Bakr received news of the first victory shortly before his death in 634. This comes from a very kind, very soft core book called Islam, Faith, Culture, History by Paul Lunde. But it sets us up pretty good. It sets us up pretty good for where we're going. All right, let's go. Yeah.
The Abracast, occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
Welcome to the Abracast. I'll be your caliph for the evening, John Towers. Thank you for clicking in. I appreciate it. Oh, we got a lot to cover tonight. So I mean, if you're playing along at home, this would be the time that you observe the ritual. I want you to grab your glass, adhere to the formula for the weapon of mass distraction. Glass, jar, bucket, fucking whatever you got, fucking do it, right? It's fill it up with ice. It's 2 shots of the cheapest fucking gin you can find. A lime slice. Why do I keep messing that up? And then tonic water, right? So go ahead and charge that motherfucker and let's go. Thank you for playing along at home. Okay, so this evening, We're going to be going off of a couple different resources. So I want to kind of go over them with you at the beginning so I don't have to keep stopping and letting you know where I'm getting what from. We're talking about the biggest book, right? The history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. We're particularly working out of volume 6 this evening. Thoughtco.com has a really awesome sort of timeline called Before the Crusades 350 to 1095. It's written by a guy named Austin Klein. And then there's a article called The Second Arab Siege of Constantinople 717 to 718 that I found on weaponsandwarfare.com. So that and this Islam, Faith, Culture, and History by Paul Lunde, and we're going to dip our little toe into Wiki a little bit as well. So before we get started, I wanted to I have a couple side notes. Yeah, I have a couple side notes. Side note about the dates. When I was looking at all of these conflicts, I saw conflicting dates, sometimes caused by these attacks and these sieges and these battles lasting for many years. Also due to the fact that whichever way, sometimes they repeat themselves. So as an example, we're going to talk about at least 2 sieges of Constantinople in which the outcome is and also places like Egypt, which took a while to completely fall, or like Sicily, who just got attacked very often. I tried to collate these dates to make them match as much as possible for this episode in these show notes, but you might see some spots where I slip up, especially as I'm transitioning out of an article into a book or onto my show notes. The second side note, just like the Romans, as the caliphate expands, it's co-opting these other people and incorporating them into their armies, right? So for this episode, to make things as easy as possible, we're going for the most part to talk about Romans, Byzantines, or Christians as a terminology for one side, and like Muslims, Arabs, and I'll probably throw in a jihadist or two for the other side. So I'm not going to get mired down into the delineation between Libyans or Carthaginians or, Bulgars or Franks, I'm not going to get tied up into it. Basically, it's going to be Muslims versus Christians or vice versa, however is more palatable to you. Okay. So I'm going to start in an unexpected place because I like to start at unexpected places. So there's this guy. He was the Roman emperor from 117 to 138. His name is Hadrian. Hadrian? You might have heard of this fucking guy because he's sort of famous for this wall that he built. It's called Hadrian's Wall, which was the inspiration for the wall in the north. Westeros, like that wall, Hadrian's Wall was built to sort of divide civilized Roman Britannia from the barbarians in the north. And it's actually pretty cool because if you read about Hadrian's Wall and you know Game of Thrones, you can already guess a great deal about Hadrian's Wall. Anyhow, another thing that Hadrian built was this temple of Aphrodite or Venus in Jerusalem. And when I say Venus, what I really mean is Venus, the goddess of beauty, pleasure, and procreation. Rocket number 9, take off to your planet, Venus. In 355, Constantine I rips this temple down and has the Church of the Holy Sepulchre built there around the supposed hill of crucifixion, or as we know it as Calvary, or as we know it as Golgotha. Are you drinking the drink of Golgotha? I don't always drink the drink of Golgotha, but when I do. All right. So 215 years later in 570, the Prophet Muhammad was born in Mecca. He founded Islam. He didn't find it. It's not like he was in jail when he found Islam. He founded Islam, and on June 8th, 632, he died. And that pretty much sets the stage for everything we're going to be talking about this week. So I hope you are buckled up. I hope you're old enough to take the ride. Take it. I hope you're old enough to go on the ride. And I hope you're buckled up, because we're going to get into this shit right here. So then after he dies, then the whole cold open takes place. And then in 633, the Muslims conquer Syria and Iraq. So maybe I should mention this. The way that I constructed this episode was, so when you read enough about this stuff, or as at least, not that I read a lot about it anymore, but when you have read enough of this stuff, not enough of the stuff, but when you've read enough of this material, you will find that there are some really kid gloves kind of versions of these things going on, especially when we start talking about the Crusades. And one of my biggest pet peeves is about, not my biggest pet peeve, but like as far as the show and stuff is concerned, is that, people, when you start talking about the Crusades, people nowadays think it was about the Christian encroachment into the Middle East. And they forget about the Muslim expansion, especially after Muhammad's death, right? So the way that this is constructed is to show you a trend. It's laying out a pattern of the expansion after Muhammad dies. And this whole episode is leading right up to the Battle of Tours. So if you're interested, and I know I've been threatening to do the Battle of Tours for quite some time. So if you're interested in it, keep your ear out. 633, Muslims conquer Syria and Iraq. This is them conquering the Persians. 635, Muslims capture Damascus from the Byzantines. Also 635, Muslims begin conquest for Persia and Syria. 636, the Battle of Yarmouk. This Byzantine commander is crushed, leaving all of Syria open to Muslim domination. 637, they take the Persian capital, and by 651, the whole of Persia. 637 also, Syria is conquered. 637 also, Jerusalem falls. And Muhammad himself foretold of this victory. This is narrated by Auf bin Mali. I went to the Prophet during the expedition of Tabuk while he was sitting in a leather tent, and he said, quote, count 6 signs and indicate the approach of the hour. My death, the conquest of Jerusalem, a plague that will affect you and kill you in great numbers as the plague that afflicts the sheep, unquote. The conquest of Jerusalem solidifies the Arab control over Palestine, which wouldn't be threatened until the First Crusade. And you guys know this story from our Godfrey de Bouillon episode. 639, Egypt is conquered. Some 4,000 men were sent against Byzantine Egypt, and they linked up with another 5,000 men and defeated a Byzantine army at the Battle of Heliopolis. The victorious Muslim armies march towards Alexandria. That's meant to be ominous. Because in Alexandria is the Great Library of Alexandria. We've talked about this on the podcast before. The Great Library of Alexandria was one of the largest and most significant libraries of the ancient world. It was part of a larger research institution which was dedicated to the Muses, the 9 goddesses of the arts. So the Library of Alexandria was not the first library. It wasn't even the first library of its kind. A long tradition of libraries existed in both Greece and the ancient Near East. The earliest recorded archive of written materials comes from an ancient Sumerian state of Uruk around 3,400 BC, when writing had only begun to develop. But this library was one of the largest and most significant libraries in the ancient world. The details about it are a mixture of history and legend. The earliest known surviving sources of information on the founding of this library is in the pseudographic letter of, Aristeas, which was composed between 180 and 145 BC. So Alexandria came to be regarded as the capital of knowledge and learning, in part because of this great library. Many important and influential scholars worked at the library during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. This thing was a storehouse of Kabbalah, and it was a storehouse of magical texts and philosophy and Gnosticism. This is before Christianity was collated and condensed and had an orthodoxy. All these different sects were running around with all these different wild ideas about Christ and what he meant and what he was and all this stuff. And all these ideas were housed there, not just about Christ, but about everything, about all these things that we talk about here, on the show. So back to it. 641 Muslims conquer south of Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia. And then in 1641, Alexandria falls. The Emir Ibn al-As was the commander. In this article I found The Life and Death of the Library of Alexandria, one of the great centers of human knowledge ever, by James Crawford. I found this on lithub.com. It reads, hold on. By AD 640, the armies of Islam had conquered Persia, Syria, and Palestine, and had advanced through Egypt to lay siege to Alexandria. The city was one of the last major footholds of the Byzantine Empire in Africa, heavily fortified, its subterranean cisterns full of fresh Nile water and its grain stores abundant. It was prepared for a war of attrition. It took 14 months for the Muslim general Emir Ibn al-As to break down the will and the spirit of the defenders, and much to the displeasure of the impatient Caliph Omar, Islam's spiritual leader. Finally, on September 29th, 641 AD, the city surrendered. As the Arabs rushed through the streets in celebration, they found a city largely emptied of its inhabitants. Many had already fled by boat to Cyprus, Rhodes, and the Byzantine capital, Constantinople. So this isn't the last we're going to hear of any of these 3 places in this episode. We're going to go to the Cyprus, we're going to go to Rhodes, and find out what these fucking guys did at Rhodes, and then we're going to go to Constantinople. 3 times maybe. Writing 5 centuries after the siege, the Muslim historian Ibn al-Kifti describes how a victorious emir talked with the Alexandrian priest John Grammarian and learned of a priceless collection of 54,000 books kept within a library in the city. Faithful and conscientious lieutenant, Emir wrote to his leader Omar and asked him what he should do with the books. The response was a study in the warped logic of fanaticism. Quote, if these writings of the Greeks agree with the book of God, unquote, said Omar, quote, they are useless and need not be preserved. But if they disagree, they are pernicious and ought to be destroyed, unquote. According to Al-Kifti, Emir obeyed without question. Vast rolls of paper and parchment were divided out among the city's 4,000 bathhouses, where they were burned to heat the water. There were so many books, it is said, that they kept the baths of Alexandria warm for over 6 months. And so Alexandria's library and its disappearance remains one of the greatest enigmas of ancient history. Now let's drink to this library. In 649, the siege and pillage of Cyprus. It was brief, and the Muslims drafted a treaty with the local rulers and left. But if you think they leave Cyprus alone after this treaty, you just don't get it yet. 652, Muslims coming up from Tunisia and across the Mediterranean on ships. This was wild for Muslims to be on ships. They had no navy. This is like the beginning of their navy. So 652, Muslims coming up from Tunisia and across from the Mediterranean on ships attack Sicily. The first time. 653, the Muslims attack Rhodes. Okay, so they steal pieces of the Colossus of Rhodes for scrap metal. The Colossus of Rhodes was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was a giant statue of the Greek sun god Helios, erected in about 280 BC. It was like this statue that stood like about 100 feet high, over 100 feet high, and it straddled this opening in this harbor wall. So if you think of like a wall, like a breaker wall or something, like in a harbor that had an opening so the boats can like funnel through, this fucking thing stood with its legs spread, just like over. Like that's the cost of getting into Rhodes, is you have to look up and see Helios's taint. 654, Muslims return and conquer Cyprus. This time they leave a garrison of troops there. 655, the Battle of Masts. Okay, this is a stunning Muslim naval victory. They beat Emperor Constant II off the coast of Lycia. Okay, so you get a couple, like as you read these, you get a couple versions of the Battle of Masts. They're both fascinating. The one the apologists use a lot was like, well, the emperor was just like a doop-a-doop-a-doop. What do these stupid Muslims know about riding boats? And they say that it was a lack of his generalship, and they spot the Muslim fleet, and he was just like, charge, and he doesn't get the time to get his boats into any kind of formation, and he rides in and gets crushed, which is embarrassing for sure. But I always wonder why these apologists take this tact, because I think what really happened was way more fascinating. So they're right? This Muslim navy did not understand or know about established naval tactics. So instead, what these guys did is they use what was called the Big Island tactic, where they massed their ships together and they lashed them together, and they would in turn, as the enemy closed in, they would lash the enemy ships together to their large mass, in effect nullifying any sea experience the Byzantines had, and basically turning the fight from a naval formation of ships versus formation of ships to a land battle. They engaged very closely. That's why the fight was called the Battle of Masts. And the fight lasted longer than a day. And, quote, the sea ran with blood and the waves piled up the bodies on the shore. The Muslims, even though they were outnumbered, cut the Byzantines into pieces, and what remained of their fleet was reportedly shattered by a storm. And this marked a period, the first period of Muslim superiority. Both they were superior on land for sure, and now they were superior by sea, which means the Muslims pretty much controlled the Mediterranean, which pretty much meant that Constantinople and the Byzantines were going to fall. It was just a matter of time. So in 667, do you know what happens? Sicily is attacked again. All right, here we go. So, are you okay? 668, the first siege of Constantinople. These attacks last on and off for 4 to 7 years. The length of this siege is a mystery lost to time, with the Muslim forces generally spending the winter on the island of Cyzicus. I think it's Cyzicus. But we must talk about Constantinople for a minute and understand that three of the city's 4 sides were facing the water. I know that we've talked about this before on the show. To the north is the Golden Horn, the east is the Bosphorus, and to the south is the Marmara Sea. And to the west, of course, is this giant wall. I'm going to more about the giant wall here in a minute. Hey guys, every mainstream show this month has an extension on Patreon for the $5 tier. The week 1 extension episode is the House of Air wands. It's an extension of the continuation of the tarot card series. Week 2 extension is the Battle the Battle of Tours, which I've been threatening to do for quite a while. It's an awesome show. The extension for week 3 is Metaphysics of Sex Magic, the Kundalini Homunculus, and the Curse of Pasiphae. And the extension for week 4 is the Patriot Conspiracy. The Patriot Conspiracy. And just like always, the $3 tier has all of this month's mainstream shows available for commercial free right now. The whole month of January is available right now. Thank you guys for the support and for listening. Thank you. Oh, a portion of all Patreon support donations and ad revenue goes to helping us send books to deployed servicemen and women overseas. We call it Tomes for Troopers. This month we were able to send out this female was looking to get a whole collection of the Songs of Ice and Fire, the Game of Thrones book. So we were able to provide them with Dance of Dragons. I was pretty excited about that. And a shout out to Marie and Heather and also my old man for donations this month. Thank you very much. Thanks for the support. All right, so back to it. These 3 great Muslim fleets were dispatched to secure sea lanes, and Emperor Constantine IV started equipping his own fleet for war. However, this was very unconventional. He equipped his fleet for the deployment of a newly developed incendiary device called Wildfire, created by the pyromancers of King's Landing. Just kidding. It was called Greek Fire, but I'm pretty sure that the Battle of Blackwater was inspired by the Siege of Constantinople. You might be saying, what is Greek Fire anyways? Well, no one really knows. Again, it is a thing that is lost to history. There was this Syrian Christian named Kalinkos, and he invented this Greek fire. And from what I gather, is it's like napalm. It's all fiery and sticky and super hot. When I was in the army, we learned to make this stuff with crazy ingredients. Like if you gave me a couple gallons of gas, some other undescribed ingredients. I'm not trying to get anyone in trouble. And then a few packs of Jell-O, I would be able to approximate napalm on some level. But so I'm worried about telling. But I'm sure there's YouTube videos about all that stuff if you guys are interested. Anyway, this massive Muslim fleet approaches, and they had no idea what they were going to face. They remember the Battle of the Masts in 655 when the Romans' entire fleet or the Romans/Byzantines, the Christians' entire fleet was crushed. And they knew they were fighting on multiple fronts, so they figured that money for defenses were tight, They were pretty confident going into this thing, one would think. The Muslim fleet casts anchor and drops the troops. They disembarked about 7 miles from the city, and over many days, the Muslim infantry attacked the city's western wall. The first historical use of Greek fire were against these jihadists at the wall, and it is said that they were, quote, dismayed by the strange and prodigious effects of this artificial fire, unquote. Which is a nice way of saying, like, they burned the fuck out of these guys, and they weren't very happy about it. So this is one of those battles. This is one of those sieges that last years. Now, remember when I first started talking about it, they said that the Muslims would retreat to the island of Cyzicus, where they would winter there, away from Constantinople. So eventually the Byzantine Empire used the Greek fire to definitively and decisively beat the Muslim navy in the seas of Marmar. It is said that eventually, over the years of the siege, 30,000 Muslims had died to not only several thousand, but to several thousand Byzantines. This gave way to a total victory. Muslim emissaries were sent to beg for the emperor to let the survivors return home unimpeded. And after a yearly tribute of 30,000 gold pieces and 50 Arab horses were agreed upon, he let the survivors leave. But if you think the Muslims were done, if you think the religion of peace was finished knocking on the gates of Constantinople, well then you don't know the old "They Might Be Giants" song, do you? So as a commentary to this, the historian George Ostrogorsky, who is a famous historian of the Byzantine studies, would say, quote, "The significance of the Byzantine victory in 678 cannot be overestimated. For the first time, the Arab advance was really checked, and the invasion, which had swept forward as irresistibly as an avalanche, was now halted in the defense of Europe against the Arab onslaught. This triumph of Constantine IV was a turning point of the worldwide historical importance. The fact that Constantinople held, saved not only the Byzantine Empire, but the whole of European civilization." We're going to look at that in a little bit more in depth in a little while. but let's get to it. We're talking about the expansion, son. 669, Morocco is conquered by the Muslims. 672, Rhodes is attacked again. 674, the religion of peace reaches Asia. August 23rd, 676, Charles Martel is born. We are not going to get into Charles Martel too much here in this episode, but I want to make a note of it only so you can understand that everything that happens from this point onwards happens in Charles Martel's lifetime. As he grows up, as he matures, these are the events that he is observing in his world, and we'll talk about Charles much more later. 677. Hold on. So the first siege of Constantinople was in 668. 677, the Muslims send a large fleet against Constantinople. And again, they didn't even make a siege this time. They just sent a large fleet. And again, they are defeated badly. Again, with the Greek fire. And again, they agree to pay an indemnity to the emperor. 698, Muslims capture Carthage in North Africa. 700, Muslims attack Sicily. Again. 711, the religion of... We talked about this in the Spanish Inquisition or the Black Legend episode. 711, the religion of peace reached Spain. They murder a bunch of Visigoths and move in, controlling pretty much all of Spain by 715. We know from the Black Legend episode that they stay there for a long time, until the late 1400s to early 1500s, where Ferdinand and Isabella finally give them the boot. 716, Lisbon is captured by the Muslims. 717, the second siege of Constantinople. Okay, this is from, a lot of this is from weaponsandwarfare.com. This is from weaponsandwarfare.com, the second Arab siege of Constantinople, 717 to 718. The siege. Caliph Suleiman named Musalama the commander of his army, and reportedly 80,000 men marching through Anatolia towards Constantinople. His plan was to invest the city from the western landward side, while a huge fleet blocked any supplies from reaching the city. That fleet numbered some 1,800 ships, carrying a further 80,000 men under the command of a general named Suleiman, but not to be confused with Suleiman the Caliph, different Suleiman. The Muslim fleet was divided into two divisions, one blockade to the Dardanelles or the Hellespont to keep any relief from coming to Constantinople from the Mediterranean, and one to hold the Bosphorus to the north, keeping out any relief from the Black Sea ports. Muslama crossed the Hellespont in July 717 and divided his forces. He took command of the main body and began the siege while sending the detachment to Adrianople to keep an eye on the Bulgars, who had been pillaging through southeastern Europe and attacked Constantinople in 712. Immediately upon his arrival, Muslama threw an attack against the walls, but it was easily beaten back. That convinced him against undertaking a frontal assault, so he began digging trenches to prevent any breakout from the city. Most of the fighting, therefore, took place on the water. Admiral Suleiman left part of his navy at Dardanelles as ordered, but led the remainder northwards to take up station on the Hellespont as they approached Constantinople. However, the leading ships were caught in a swift and unfamiliar current and began to tangle them. Seizing his opportunity, Leo, who was in charge of Constantinople at this time, quickly lowered the chain protecting the Golden Horn. Now, this is something that I totally remember talking about on the podcast. They have an anti-boat chain from one end of the Golden Horn, like the little peninsula part of the Golden Horn, to the wall, the port side wall of Constantinople. Now, when I talked about it, I can't remember what episode I talked about this in, but it was actually about the fall of Constantinople, which happens way later. But it's cool that they mentioned this boat chain. If you guys remember what episode it is, let me know, because I can't fucking remember. I can't even remember why I would have been talking about it. Where am I at? I lost my fucking place. The upper harbor of the city, and dashed out into the Muslim fleet before they could form into a line of battle. Using Greek fire, his ships quickly destroy or capture a large number of vessels, while the rest retreated. Suleiman, feared sailing past the city now, for another such battle could destroy the rest of his fleet. Thus, the northern avenue for aid for a time was kept open. The Muslim effort was off to a poorer start, and soon bad news came from Damascus. Caliph Suleiman had died of a stomach ailment, and Omar II, not known for his military acumen, had replaced him. For the next several months, little happened except for bad luck. The winter 1717 to 1718 was much colder than usual, and snow lay on the ground for more than 3 months. For an army born and raised in Arabia and Egypt, it was disconcerting at best, deadly at worst. Delays in the delivery of supplies from Egypt, coupled with bad weather, meant the deaths of thousands of besieging soldiers. The Muslims hoped to take the initiative in the spring of 718 with the arrival of a new fleet from Egypt bringing 50,000 reinforcements. The 400 ships of the fleet from Egypt slipped past the Byzantine fleet in the Golden Horn at night, thus avoiding a naval battle, and anchored at the Hellespont that cut off the flow of supplies that would eventually have spelled the city's doom. But Leo's navy again saved the day. He was aided by the desertion of a large number of crew members from the new Egyptian fleet, sailors who were Coptic Christians and had been pressed into Muslim service. Learning of the enemy fleet's disposition, Leo launched a surprise attack in June and caught them completely unawares. The Greek fire once again caused both destruction and terror. The Christian crews deserted wholesale to the welcoming Byzantine forces, and the northern blockading fleet was destroyed. And Leo followed up his victory with an attack on Muslim forces on the Asian side of the Sea of Marmara, despite opposite the capital. That attack was so unexpected that Muslim soldiers and sailors were slaughtered by the thousands. Leo, at this point, proved himself to be a diplomat as well as a general, and he sent envoys to the Bulgars, who persuaded their king Tervel to attack the Muslim army from the west. In July, Tervel's soldiers drove back the Muslim holding force at Andropol and attacked Muslama's forces in the rear, defeating them and inflicting some 22,000 casualties. This new threat was reinforced by the rumor that a Frankish... Pay attention to this. Ding, ding. The new threat was reinforced by the rumor that a Frankish army was marching across Europe to assist their fellow Christians. The Muslims had not yet fought the Franks, but had heard tales of their formidable military power. Caliph Omar decided it was time to bring the siege to a close. On 15 August 718, Muslama led the army away from Constantinople. The results. The defeat at Constantinople was the first disastrous loss the armies of Islam had suffered. There have been occasional defeats, but never a catastrophe such as this of the 210,000 Muslim soldiers and sailors who took part in it. Reportedly, only 30,000 actually saw their homeland again. Of the more than 2,000 ships reported to have been involved, only 5 supposedly made it home. Had Muslama's armies captured the city and route to Eastern Europe, would have virtually unguarded, little organized resistance could have been mounted against the horde of Muslim troops until they reached Central Europe. Constantinople, the seat of political, religious, and economic power in the Christian East, probably would have become Islam's capital, as it did in the wake of Muslim capture in 1453. But that's another story. The Eastern Orthodox Church may have disappeared with untold consequences in the Eastern Europe and Russia, although such did not happen in 1453. Sea power would have been completely in Muslims' hands, for no European population at the time owned a significant navy. None would until the Vikings a century later. Even with the Frankish victory at Tours in France 15 years afterwards, Islam could well have become the dominant European and therefore world religion. The Byzantine victory insulated Europe from Islam, but only from other outside influences. Hellenistic knowledge and culture survived in many ways, flourished in the Middle East and Africa, while Europe entered the Dark Ages. Militarily, Europe was strong, but cultural progress was at a crawl. Not until the Crusades and the resulting revival of the trade with the East that the old knowledge rediscovered, and the Renaissance was the result. It is interesting to speculate what Europe might have been like if Constantinople had fallen 7 centuries before it did. And I would like to take this moment to speculate about that. What if Constantinople fell 600 or 700 years before it actually did? What if this siege or the first siege of Constantinople would have handed the Muslims Constantinople? I think the fabric of the world would be 100% different. I think our planet would be irreconcilably different than it is actually today. And I'm going to talk about why. With Constantinople gone, the Mediterranean in the hands of the Muslims, basically the next target would have been Italy, who did not have a unified government. They had a fractured mosaic of small kingdoms and Rome. They had the Pope within striking distance of this Muslim expansion, with no other focus other than that boot hanging out. Charles Martel had not yet unified the Franks in France, or Francia as it was called, and as the expansion might have moved through Spain and into France, he would not have had time to show up even for the Battle of Tours. This puts all southern Europe in danger, ultimately Britain, Ireland, and Scotland, and inevitably over the Alps into northern Europe. I think all of this, even if the whole of Europe, Russia, and Asia somehow didn't end up under the crescent moon, it would have changed Western civilization so much that it would have been totally alien to us today. But this is not where we're going to end our story. As you see, in order for the next episode, we have to end this story on a down note. In 1719, Muslims take Septimania in modern-day southern France, which will later become known as the Languedoc, which we should remember from our Gnostic Holocaust episode about the Cathar Crusade. Umayyad Caliphate forces seized Barcelona and the Septimanian city of Narbonne. Probably Narbonne, it's French, I don't know. A sizable number of town defenders and inhabitants were killed in the aftermath by the victorious Muslim forces. In 720, Narbonne became the capital city of Muslim Septimania. A mosque was established there inside a church. In 730, Muslim forces move in and begin to lay siege to the French city of Avignon. And this leaves us right where we need to be to continue and talk about Charles the Hammer Martel and the Battle of Tours. Thank you guys for listening. Hey, thank you guys for tuning in, and thanks for all the support. Please remember to swing by and give us a 5-star rating and a good review. Hit up the mailing list for monthly bonus content and access to graphic components of the show when available. Every mainstream of the show this month has an extension on Patreon for the $5 tier. Week 1 is the House of Air Wands. It's the tarot card extension. Week 2 is the Battle of Tours. Week 3 extension is Metaphysics of Sex Magic, the Kundalini Homunculus, and the Curse of Pasiphae. And week 4 is the Patriot Conspiracy. And just like always, the $3 tier, all of this month's mainstream shows are available commercial free. Right now, that's for the whole month. And a portion of all of our Patreon support, all of our donations and ad revenue goes to helping us send books for deployed servicemen and women, American servicemen and women overseas. This month we sent out, someone was trying to get a whole complete collection of the Game of Thrones book, the Songs of Ice and Fire, so we were able to send them Dances with Dragons. I want to send a shout out to Marie and Heather for their donations, and also for my old man who donated for Tomes for Troopers. I like that. Thank you guys very much. And last but not least, please remember to check into abercast.com. The feature topic links are all up and running, I think. You can find links to social media there, and you can also check out some comic books or graphic novels if you're interested. Thanks a lot, guys. See you next week.
In the extended episode, The Battle of Tours, Constantinople stands, leaving Spain as the only way Muslims can press into Europe on their quest for world domination. In 723, as the religion of peace crosses the Pyrenees into southern France and sets their sights on Aquitaine, a prince named Charles the Hammer Martel rises in the north intent on halting Muslim expansion. A portion of all Patreon support and donations goes to Tomes for Troopers to send books and other media to deployed American service members.
O prophet, jihad against the unbelievers and the hypocrites, and be firm against them. Their abode is hell, an evil refuge indeed. Quran 9:73. When you meet the unbelievers in the battlefield, strike off their heads. And when you have laid them low, bind your captives firmly. Quran 47:4. Again, O ye who believe, fight the unbelievers who gird you about, and let them find firmness in you, and know that Allah is with those who fear him. Quran 9:123. Prophet, make war on the unbelievers and the hypocrites and deal rigorously with them. Hell shall be their home, and evil fate. Quran 9:7-3. Then, when the sacred months have passed, slay the idolaters wherever you find them, and take them captive and besiege them and prepare them each ambush. But if they repent and establish worship and pay the poor due, then leave their way free. Lo, Allah is forgiving and merciful. Quran 9:5.